In this clip, I'd like to introduce the landscape assignment. By now, hopefully students have gained a better appreciation for the paint that we're using. Hopefully it's easier for you to mix and apply the paint to the surface. We've been, for the most part, for the first few assignments, kind of focusing on refining your brush techniques, the way you paint the surface. You want to, in this assignment, look at it as kind of loosening up your technique. We want to be more expressive with the paint. When you paint in the impressionistic technique, we want to think of it as a visual poem, in that the student has their source image, and from that source image what they want to do is look at the information and try to replicate it, yes, give the essence of the source image that they're looking at, but they want to do it in a more poetic way, meaning that not every bit of detail, not every blade of grass, every detail, branch, whatever it is that's in your source, don't look at it as you're trying to replicate that. You're looking at it as an overall, the source you look at as an overall, and you want to give an impression of what you're looking at. And so it's important to put the most important information, emphasize those elements, and the rest is just you need to suggest it. We're not making the photograph, not in this assignment. There may be other artists that are obsessed with reproducing every little bit of detail, but in this we want to learn to be more expressive with the paint, to double load your brush, putting multiple paints, usually a highlight, a midtone, and a shadow on your brush at the same time. And then as you make marks on the surface, it will create the illusion of depth and spatial depth in the composition due to those contrasting value tones. And so you really want to think of the painting too in layers. You want to start with the foundation of the image that you're looking at. Think about what is the underlying elements that need to be there first so that other elements, other structures can be put on top of them. And so when we look at these paintings here, what you'll notice is the students are showing the essence of the image, but there's a lot of information that's left up to the viewer to, in their brain, fill in that information. And so that's what successful landscape painting does most of the time. It's that the artist gives you enough items, objects, information in the painting itself, and the student, and then the viewer kind of pieces together in their mind. And so the mind kind of is allowed to be playful with the painting and reconnect to different elements in it, maybe with past experiences looking at it and gaining the appreciation from that. And so, as I mentioned, starting with structure, we want to establish the darker tones first. That's the basic 101 of most painting is that establish the dark tones, get the base, the foundation going, as I was mentioning, and then from there start layering information on top to give the viewer an idea of what it is that you're expressing in the composition. And so there's where the idea of a visual poem comes, in that you're giving just enough where the viewer sees it and can connect to it and go, oh, that's supposed to be grass. Oh, there's trees. Oh, I remember a tree like that at our old property or whatever it may be. And so that's kind of the goal of this assignment. We're not faithfully reproducing every bit of detail that is in our source image. We are looking at it and then taking the essence away from that source and applying it to the painting itself. And so it's really good to kind of start with a study. And so I have an example here. A student did this study here. This is just on 11 by 14 paper, and we just taped off a smaller area of that. And what the student did is just kind of practice putting the paint onto surface, kind of blending this together, smearing the background, doing a little dab and different kind of little techniques to give the impression through the texture of the brush stroke that the student is applying to the surface, give the impression of the image that they're looking at. And so for this one, the student was replicating this image here. And so it's not a one-for-one. The photograph is not going to be hanging next to the painting itself. But what we have is just kind of mimicking what they see in the source image here, and kind of giving the idea, the impression of that. From far away, it all blends together and they look almost, very exact in the way that they're created. That's kind of the goal of this assignment. Starting with a great source image. Ideally, it's a photograph that you took. Something, you can go out, throughout San Antonio, hopefully across Texas. There's such beautiful scenery that you can photograph. And so as you're out and about and you're seeing these things, take a good photo and think about how would you replicate that with the paint. And so if you don't have a good source image, you're not really going to be successful. And you don't have to just use one source image. You can have one if you say you really like the ground in this one, or maybe the sky in this one, and maybe you have another image that you liked in which you prefer the clouds in this image as well. And so what you can do is you can piece these elements together in order to create the painting that you want. And so it's up to you. It doesn't have to be one. The famous photographer Ansel Adams, that's what he would do. He would, splice or overlay, a night sky or a moonlit sky with a mountain range that he had, and they probably weren't happening at the same time when he took those two photos, but it made for a better composition when you bring those elements that are really successful and you bring them together, and overall the composition becomes that much better. And so for imagery, what you want to do is you don't have to replicate everything, as I said. And so you can see here, the student, or in this image here, we're using this as the source image. We have a nice little cactus there. And so the student just loosely drew the most important elements onto their surface. And so here, we're just giving an idea of the cactus, how many pieces. It's not a one-for-one exact replication of the cactus, but it's enough. So it's not an exact, as I said, but it's enough information. And then from there, what the student will do is, using the source, will try to replicate the brushwork and the texture and stuff that mimics the scene that they're looking at. And so that is the ultimate goal. And so that's really all you need, just enough little rough sketch where the horizon line is. If you have mountains or some kind of tree line or something like that, give your that top contour line of that. Any kind of elements that are down in the foreground. And then I would begin with the sky. That's normally where I begin in most of my compositions. So starting at the top and working yourself down. If you want to establish the horizon, you can do that first. A lot of times you're going to need to put a dark brown, dark reddish brown, kind of as the base overall. You can do that to the entire composition if you wanted to, or you could just do it for where the ground actually is itself. A lot of painters will actually kind of use a burnt sienna or that rusty kind of reddish brown to kind of stain the background. And then that is because usually in landscape you're using mostly greens and blue tones and stuff like that. That red acts as a complement and makes the blues and greens stand out from that background. And so starting with kind of a reddish brown is a really good kind of tip to begin. But you don't have to, but I would recommend it at least where the ground is. If you're going to have a really light blue sky, sometimes you don't necessarily have to put the reddish tone up there, the burnt sienna, but sometimes doing a real kind of a thin wash still makes the blue kind of look more dynamic, and it gives you some range where the blue and the red interact, gives you some kind of nice gray tones as well. And so kind of figure out where your horizon line is, establish that, and then from there start to paint in your sky. If you have clouds, it's really good to kind of work the clouds in. Don't think of this as Bob Ross in that one little stroke and it's perfect. Most painters are going to work in a layering technique, and so you'll put as much information as you can, kind of get a basic shape going, maybe some textural elements in there. Let that dry, and then you can put another layer. Normally, when you're working wet into wet, so if you're establishing the blue here, I'm going to take this down. What you can do, you can see this nice value range where it's real dark here, and then it's a much lighter as it gets to this side. And so that value contrast creates spatial depth. It creates the illusion that it's a broad space that these items can sit in. And so without that broad space, it just doesn't look as successful to the viewer. Here's a work here that a student was testing before they were going to their final composition. You can kind of see where there's not a lot of value contrast. There is some dark here that kind of took that idea that, well, you're supposed to put dark here and make it lighter, but it doesn't blend, it doesn't transition. The cloud is more of a shape, rather than, the poofy, volumetric kind of form that it normally is. And so try to have kind of a broader range of value when you create that. And then I would establish the blues first. Normally I'll start with a phthalocyan or even your ultramarine. For most skies, especially if you want more of that kind of bright, sunny sky, the phthalocyan is kind of the best to use. Kind of get it dark up here at the top. If you want to mix a little bit of the crimson red, that gives it kind of a little bit of a purplish tinge that you can then kind of push more blue. Just leave a little bit of the red kind of at the edges. It creates that vignette effect. And then as you go further away from the top, you just put more and more white into it. And you can kind of see that. And so you get this dynamic range of value from dark to light. And so that's kind of where you start. And then for your clouds, what you want to do is kind of tip your brush into the white in kind of in my term I use is kind of popping it around. Think of it also as kind of like if you are shivering and your hand is kind of moving around a little bit. It's kind of the technique you use in which you kind of want to keep your brush kind of moving around. Clouds are not just solid forms, and so it's kind of good to kind of get it and kind of put get this kind of the shape established. The student here, this was kind of a study. They didn't completely finish it, and they just kind of were getting an idea. From here, they moved on to something else. But anyway, you can get kind of an idea of how to kind of begin with those clouds. If you have more of a kind of a sunset in your composition, this is a really nice one. The assignment is a landscape assignment, but you're more than welcome to choose cityscape, a seascape, combination of those things. And so in this one here, you can see the student has put that kind of blue tone as the kind of establishing the base tone up here, and then they stopped at a certain point and then brought the kind of yellowy tone up. Now, if you were painting this at the same time, that blue and that orange will mix and get kind of a grayish or a grayish-green kind of color tone there. So she brought it up so far. Normally, you'll want to put white where those two colors come together. And so by putting white there, what that does is it acts as a buffer, an area where you bring the blue down into the white, you bring the orange up into the white, and then you leave the kind of the white line there to act as that kind of buffer. And this one here, she got a little green toning, so you can see here she kind of went back over with a darker kind of tone to kind of get to break that line where the color was not exactly where she wanted it. But once the blue and the orange was down there, she allowed that to dry, and then she went back over it with these kind of pinky violet tones on top of it. So it's that layering effect. And so a painting it can be done in one session, but a really successful landscape normally takes several sessions in order to build up the layers to get the information that you need for it to be successful. So you can see in this one here, the student, once again, really nice dynamic range of value contrast from that purpley tinge into the violet. If they stop, let that dry, then they come back in with the yellow and establish that kind of sunset quality there. And so I'm not a big fan of the silhouette, but this student did, you can see, put a nice little kind of textural elements on the tree itself. And then there in the ground, there's some nice little kind of references to trees and to different bushes and things in the background. But it's that dynamic range of value that you need to create in order for it to look nice, to look successful. That's where you get the depth. You want to have that pictorial depth for the interest to be there, for it to be inviting for you to kind of engage with it and to look at it. And so that's what we're looking for. And so a lot of times too, what you can do is just kind of be loose with the paint. This was an example that I was showing one class one semester, and I just took some purpley tones, mixed in some brown, umber brown, and some violet. Up here, I had the yellow ochre with the umber, with a lot of white, with a little bit of the ultramarine blue to kind of create this gray tinge here, and just kind of create an atmospheric quality. And then from there, the artist can, layer the trees, layer whatever information they want to lay on top of it. Animals, if you want animals, buildings, whatever it may be. And so it's kind of fun to be really loose with your brush and just allow the paint to happen. Very similar to the video clip I showed at the beginning of the semester where the guy does the background and he puts in all the different color tones like a rainbow. It's really garish, and then he comes back in with the white, and the white kind of just unifies it all together. And so that's kind of what's happening here. That white tone, you can see how much white paint is in this composition, and that white kind of just subtly unifies visually all the color, all the paint that you put in there, and makes it look good. And so work that lighter tone into it in order to make it look, have more of a value contrast and have more volume overall to the composition. So a lot of times this is kind of where you would begin, establish your ground and then kind of be playful with the sky. You can see here I've used a dry brush, a brush without any paint on it, and really kind of fuzz this line out. So there's not a discernible line between the ground and the sky, the horizon line there. And so from there you could layer on top. And so a lot of times that's what artists do. As you have leftover paint, you can kind of experiment with backgrounds and other ones. And so, as I was saying, establish your horizon line. Figure out where it is in the composition you're going to be. You don't need to trace this image on unless you have something like a building that you need to have a lot of information in it. This one here, this is Laura from a few semesters. This one here, the student didn't trace anything. They just looked at their source and kind of just painted it in. You can see that a lot of the edges are not crisp and clean, which is fine because you're just giving an impression of that. But you can, as you're painting, go back in and clean up shapes by just altering the colors that you have behind it. Start with a great source image. Find a source image that you want to use, whatever it may be. It's a landscape. The studies are great to do studies beforehand. You can just do it on any kind of heavy cardstock paper or watercolor paper. And kind of experiment with how to kind of make clouds, how to get it darker toned up at the top, and then how to kind of layer the clouds on top of it. And so kind of be more free with your brush work and kind of see what happens. Also, when you come down and do the grass layers too, remember you're going to want to layer that information. And so it's not just one green tone that's going to be there. You can see you need darker greens, you need yellowy based greens, more white, a whole range of green tones when you're creating grass or thatchy kind of a look. This one here, the student layered the information. You can see all the different bluish green tones that the student used. Give that look of thatchy kind of bushy, scrubby bush there. I think the student was from Arizona, and so she wanted to kind of create that look of where she was from. And so if you have source images from where you live or where you're from, feel free to use those as your source images for this assignment. If you want to borrow an image online that you use for educational purposes, search photography, landscape photography, and find something that you think will work compositionally. We don't want it too overly dramatic, too complex. Try to stay away from crashing waves and all the stuff like that. And so it's more, you want to have a good variety of items and objects in your source image, but you also don't want it to be too overly complex. At this time in the semester, we're looking to kind of give the impression of this landscape source that you're looking, not like in the advanced still life where we want to thoroughly reproduce all the detail. And so it's like telling a good story. You need good bits and parts of it, but a lot of it you can kind of let it run and let the viewer or the listener's imagination kind of fill in the overall bits of information. So that is the project. That's the assignment. Source image, find good source image. You can send that to me, your source images, and let me help you, decide which one would be best to proceed with. And then once I give you the okay with it, have your printout, and then begin painting. If you're going to use an image like off of your iPad or your laptop or tablet or whatever device it may be, just be careful, don't get paint all over it. That's why it's always good to kind of get the printout first. And so, worst case scenario, you can always go to a place like FedEx where they can do a printout, photographic quality printout for you if you want. Find your source image. If you need to trace down before you begin painting, give yourself just the contour bits of information for the items or the objects that you're looking at, and then from there go. If you're painting kind of a more open painterly composition like these, just kind of find your horizon lines wherever they may be, and then paint from there. And so have fun and see what you can create. See what you can create and what you can accomplish with this assignment. Thank you.